we're not going to think about the consumer's problem from a different perspective. We're sort of going to flip the direction of problem solving. So we're going to think about the opposite problem, where we take the constraint of our old problem, our Walrasian problem, and we're going to make that the objective function. We're going to take the objective function of the old Walrasian problem and make that the constraint. So what was the constraint before? It said you can't spend more than your budget. So it was a constraint on expenditure. And so what are we going to want to do? We're going to want to optimize expenditure. What does optimizing expenditure mean? It means paying the least amount possible. So this is going to be called the expenditure minimization problem. We're going to minimize expenditure. And what was the objective function of the Walrasian paradigm? It was to maximize utility, right? So now that's going to be a constraint, and it says you have to achieve some utility threshold. You have to keep the consumer at some utility level. So to sort of summarize, we're going to switch the objective function and the constraint, and that's called the dual problem, or it's called duality in general. And that's going to allow us to solve an expenditure minimization problem, or that's going to indicate that we should solve a expenditure minimization problem, where we minimize expenditure subject to keeping the consumer at a given fixed utility level. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, there's two main reasons. One is sort of the philosophical or intuitive reason, which is to say, maybe we have some consumer and they're changing jobs. They're moving from one place to another city. And we want to say, how much do we have to pay them to be willing to make this change in jobs, right? Prices are different in a different city. And so the prices are going to change. The income is going to change. We want to say, how much are they going to have to spend to keep the same level of consumption that they had before? Or the same utility level, not necessarily level of consumption in terms of goods, but utility, how much are we going to have to compensate them, either in positive or negative compensation? How much are we going to have to change their income so that their utility level remains the same, so that when they consume goods under a new set of prices, they're going to be as well off as they were before. So in other words, is there a cheaper way of providing the same utility? The second reason is a mathematical one, and we're going to see that the solution to this problem has a lot to say about the solution to the Walrasian problem. It's going to allow us to decompose the Walrasian demand into different components by using this expenditure minimization, the results from the expenditure minimization problem. So there's a very deep connection between these two problems, which we're going to see in a little bit. And discovering that deep connection allows us to say more about each problem by examining them jointly rather than examining one or the other alone. So formally, the problem is the following. Minimize the price times the vector of consumption, the price times the bundle, which is the total expenditure. So the total expenditure is called, what we call the total expenditure is the price times x. And that's subject to the utility of x being greater than or equal to some level u. So in this case, u is just a real number, just a number that represents how good the utility was that we want to meet. How good is the utility we want to meet? And so what we're asking for is the cheapest way to ensure a utility of u or higher. Okay? And this is going to be, so it's formally, it's a function of two parameters. One is P, a vector of prices, and one is U, a utility level. So remember that the Walrasian paradigm was also, the Walrasian demand was also a vector, a function of two parameters. Again, the price level, but that time an income, right? So the income was given, and the utility was what we were trying to solve for. Here, the utility is given, and the expenditure, or the money, is what we're trying to solve for. So we're switching the role of utility and money. So again, we're looking for the cheapest way to ensure a utility of U or higher. Now, it's going to turn out just like before when we said you don't have to spend all of your income. If you have a strictly monotone and continuous utility function, then you will end up spending all your income. The same here. As long as prices are positive and you have a strictly positive utility function, a strictly monotone and continuous utility function, the same thing will be true. You will always exactly get a utility of little u. So big U of the demand will always be exactly equal to little u. You're not going to give the person extra utility because that extra utility costs you something because prices are positive. So in exactly the same way that before we said, as long as everything's well behaved, you're going to spend exactly your income. In the solution, the optimal bundle spends all the income. Here, the optimal solution provides no more utility than little u. The solution to this problem is going to be called H star. So H is named after an economist Hicks, so it's called the Hicksian demand. That's why it's H. And it specifies the set of minimizers. So H star is exactly this, plays the same role as X star did before. So X star, remember, was the set of Walrasian demands, the set of maximizers of the utility maximization problem. H star is the set of minimizers of the expenditure minimization problem. The Hicksian demand is usually called, or often called, the compensated demand, because the consumer, when prices change, spends the same amount, right? I mean, she can spend more money. She doesn't spend the same. All right, let me start over. Hicksian demand is often called compensated demand. And that's because when prices change, the utility of the consumer has to remain fixed. So if prices increase, we have to give the consumer the ability to spend more money or compensate her for that price change. So when you go to the store, if you have to maintain a utility of 10, now remember, a utility of 10 doesn't mean anything, but that's the level at which you have to, given the utility function, a utility of 10 is meaningful. You have to maintain a utility of 10. The consumer goes into the store and sees everything's more expensive. She's going to have to spend more money, which means that we have to compensate her. We got to give her some more money so that she can meet that utility criteria of 10. And just like we had an indirect utility function, we're going to have here what's called the expenditure function. And the expenditure function is just P, the vector of prices, times H star, the vector of Hicksian demands. So P dot X is an amount that's spent, and that is how much do you spend when you're minimizing expenditure. So just like the indirect utility function was how happy are you, what's your utility level when you take the optimal choices, this is how much do you spend when you take the optimal choices. So H star plays exactly the role of X star, and E plays exactly the role of V, of little v. So before, we were thinking of ourselves as sitting on a budget line and looking for the indifference curve that the largest indifference curve, largest as in the highest utility level, that met that utility, that budget line. So we were moving outwards on utility. You know what? I think I'm going to do this on paper. It's a nice picture, but I think it's better to build it. So make my line a little thinner. So, right, we have our XY plane, we got our X's and our Y consumption, and our old paradigm, our Walrasian paradigm, the way that we solved it was we had a fixed budget set, and we said you can't violate this budget set, you're going to live on that line, and then we looked for the utility function, so we had and then we had one utility, right? And this was V of X. So this would be X star, and this is V. This was V, which is equal to U of X star, right? The utility line represented the indifference curve that was tangent to our budget line represented the maximum utility you could receive under that budget set, right? So what's noticeable in this picture is in order to sort of solve the problem in our head, there's one budget set and many utility levels, many indifference curves. Each indifference curve is a utility level. And the optimum occurred when there was a tangency, right? Except when there's corner solutions. We're talking about interior solutions here. So if we go backwards now and think about the opposite. So if we think about the dual problem, the expenditure minimization problem, where was my... Oh. So if I have here now, instead of having one budget line, my constraint is given by a utility level, right? A given utility level. So I'm going to have one utility level, u little u, right? This is a lowercase u. I'm going to call this u bar, and that's our constraint. What does it mean to make the consumer at least as good as u bar? It means that I have to live in the upper contour set, right? I live here in the upper contour set of u bar. I can pick anything above u bar, but I can't pick something lower than u bar. Now, as I said before, as long as everything's well behaved, you have strict monotonicity and continuity, and you have positive prices, then what's going to happen is you're going to actually pick something on u bar. So instead of thinking of the entire constraint set, we're going to think of our constraint set just as literally this line u. You have to pick a point on this indifference curve represented by u bar. And now what we're going to do is we're going to think, what is the smallest amount of income? What is the smallest expenditure that I can do to get on this, right? So we can think about what is the income if what are the bundles if I have income I, right? So this is related to some income I. That's all the bundles that cost I will live on a line. And remember, this would be I over px, and this would be I over py, would be the two intercepts. Now I can make I smaller, right? This, by the way, if I spend I can get on the utility curve, right? In fact, many things on I give me better than u bar. Anything in between the two lines is in the upper contour set, but in particular, there's things that generate exactly u bar where it crosses. Now, as I could make I smaller, right? I could make I smaller. I would have less options that give me above u bar, and I would call this guy maybe I prime. And I prime is less than I. I spend less money on I prime on the I prime line than I do on the I line, but I do still meet my utility criteria. And I could keep making I smaller. I could make it too small. And notice that on this, call it I double prime. On I double prime, I can't reach utility u bar. There's no level here. There's no consumption bundle on that line that generates a utility of u bar, right? Everything is strictly lower than it everywhere. The one that does the best is when the cheapest expenditure is going to be exactly when it just stops touching it, right? When it just gets past it, which of course is going to be given a tangency, and we'll call this I star, although it's actually maybe better to call it E. And we're going to have a consumption of X star, nope, not X star, H star X and H star Y. So you can see that there's a very, very tight parallel between this problem, conceptually thinking about it, and the previous problem of utility maximization. In one case, and you can see exactly graphically what I mean by exchanging the objective function and the constraint. Before, we were moving along different indifference curves. That was our objective function, but our budget was fixed. That was the constraint. Now we're moving along the budget. That's our objective function, but we're fixed on an indifference curve. That's our constraint. But the solution appears to look appears the same, right? It is a tangency between a budget line and an indifference curve. So the solution, the optimized quantity, is given by a tangency between the same two objects, between the budget and the indifference curve, and the optimal consumption is that point of tangency. And so there's good reason to think that the solution to one problem is going to be very, very related to the solution of another problem, right? But I think, so let me just say, I guess I can say a little bit more about this, and then we'll do an example in the next lecture. It's the same tangency between the marginal rate of substitution, which is, of course, the slope of this indifference curve, and the ratio of prices, which is the slope of that budget line, right? Those are the things that, those are the interpretations of those objects on the picture I just drew. And so you can see why it's called the dual problem. But we can see the same tangency from the Lagrangian as well. So we could set this up through a Lagrangian, and we could solve the problem, algebraically, and we would find that we see the same tangency. But I'm going to do that actually in the next lecture. I'm going to split them apart.